It's said that you don't know what you have until it's gone. What if, however, you lose it when you're too young to remember having it in the first place? Or, what if you have to watch it fade away over years or even decades? Welcome to the Defending Vision podcast, where this blind man shows you exactly how he sees it. Hardship, humor, and keeping a vision alive. Throw on some headphones for the full audio experience. One day, at the end of my senior year of high school, I was in a classroom preparing to present my independent study project. I'd built a small wind tunnel and an even smaller wind turbine as an experiment. My friend Mike was hanging out and helping set up. As we worked, a parent who clearly did not know me entered the classroom, remarked that I really should have color-coded all of the wires, and then proceeded to leave. Without missing a beat, Mike said, "You're not even colorblind. You're the regular kind." And with that, a story was born that has been told many times. In reality, though, that category of regular kind is massive. Blindness can mean complete darkness. It can mean simply losing central or peripheral vision, or something in between. Eyesight can be lost in an instant, or over years, or even decades. The story is different for everyone. Personally, I was diagnosed when I was 3 years old. I have a brain tumor that sits in the optic chiasm, the region behind the eyes, where the nerves travel from the eyes, cross, and then reach the brain with visual information. My tumor sits precisely where those nerves cross, affecting eyesight from both eyes. At 3.5, a 9-hour brain surgery was performed to remove roughly 60 to 70% of this tumor. My earliest memories are from the hospital just after this surgery. I don't know what eyesight I had beforehand, but I know that after, I had none in my left eye and only shadows, shades of gray, in my right eye. High contrast, dark objects on a light wall, things like that. Since then, I've been on a myriad of chemotherapies and other treatments to maintain the remaining portion of the tumor at the smallest size possible. Those with various medical conditions will know that no change or stable is considered a big win. For years, my remaining eyesight was painstakingly measured, until at around 13 years old, I was declared completely blind. Today, people ask me, is it just darkness? And my answer is no. And I don't know if this has to do with the fact that I had some eyesight earlier in life or not, but I would describe myself as a very visual thinker. I always have a visual image of my surroundings. Of course, this comes from touching and hearing what's around me, not seeing it. And when working on things like 3D printing, for example, I have no problem visualizing the three-dimensional part in my mind. So, while I grew up never having eyesight that I could truly trust, every shadow I saw could either be a pole I might run into, or an actual shadow cast by a tree well overhead. Others have had very different experiences. Today, I'm bringing you part 1 of a conversation with my good friend Daria Zawadzki and her brother Isaac Lidsky. These are two absolute forces of nature, academically, professionally, and personally. Their stories are amazing. I think you'll find them fascinating, moving, and inspirational. They are both excellent role models to anyone blind or sighted. So without further ado, welcome to our conversation. It's such an honor having both of you on the show. Daria, you and I have known one another for many years now. Isaac and I clearly need to connect more. Let's start with the basics. This is to both of you. When did you begin noticing problems with your eyesight? What was the ultimate diagnosis, and how has your eyesight changed since then?
Darren, why don't
Do you
you
want me,
take it first? Because
do
I
you want me
think
to
that's
take it
more
first since I was
more
diagnosed first?
logical
Yeah,
chronologically. Yeah.
I was thinking that. So, I mean, I started noticing significant issues by high school. Isaac and I and our older sister all have retinitis pigmentosa. We have a recessive very rare genetic disease. So my parents, unbeknownst to them, carry this recessive genetic mutation, but no family history. So they're sighted and
Hmm.
no history known to us at least. So retinitis pigmentosa starts out often with trouble at night, night blindness. So I was
Hmm.
having trouble in dark places. Our doctors were missing it. He wasn't catching it for a while. It is hard to catch in early stages because it starts with very peripheral, and the retina can still look normal on exam or normal
Hmm.
enough in the early stages. So we had been going to a good eye doctor every year for checkups. So my parents were like, "You're fine," and I was getting more clumsy and bumping into things at school, and eventually it led to a near car accident. I was driving by the time I was diagnosed, and I drove onto the wrong side of a highway with cars coming at me, and just
Hmm.
by some miracle wound up on a median, almost hitting a tree. And I remember that day I was just sobbing, and I thought to myself, if people saw the world the way I did, nobody would drive. It would just be impossible. So
Hmm.
at that point, they stepped it up and said, no, we have to see a specialist because this doctor keeps telling us everything's fine. So we did see a specialist, and I was diagnosed at 17, at which point they also brought my siblings in. So,
Yeah,
and
in
if you want to take
Isaac,
it
in
from
your
there.
book, your description of that day and all the testing sounded very familiar.
Oh, sure.
Your
Yeah.
description of what the dot machine, that was
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes. The dreaded dot machine. Which is one of for folks listening, is one of a few tests or machines, they use to diagnose this type of stuff. Um, these types of sight conditions. I was diagnosed before I realized I was having any issues with my sight, right? So here's my older sister, Daria. At first, it seems like she's sort of clumsy and absent-minded. Then it starts to seem like, oh my God, wait a minute, maybe it has something to do with her sight. I was, a 13-year-old boy, perfectly content in my own universe, of which I was the center, of course, and everything was perfect, including myself. Um, and so I was really more miffed. I didn't understand what Daria's sight issues had to do with me and why I had to spend the whole day, subjected to all these tests or stuff. Of course, now looking back, obviously, they get it. It was genetic, and you want to make sure no one else has it, or all that kind of stuff. Anyway, long story shorter, it took a little while for me. It took a little longer for me to be diagnosed. Um, but even at that first visit, they kind of put me in the seems like Isaac has it column.
Hmm.
Would like to do some further testing, and then so here I was at 13 being told that I had this blinding disease, when like my primal response was like 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 no,
You're like,
no, I
they're
don't,
wrong.
like, and then denial worked for a little bit, and plowing myself along with my family into the search for the cure worked for a little bit, and then I had to confront the fact that, yeah, you are losing your sight.
Hmm. I was thinking about that, just that difference of finding out and being diagnosed at 17 versus 13. Um, you have it's all. I mean, just those 4 years. It's a very different part of life.
Hmm.
And you're at a different point, I suppose, in terms of how you view sort of your future coming up. Daria, I assume you were, had your eyes set on college at that point. Um,
I was diagnosed 6 weeks before leaving for college. So I
oh
got
my
to college
gosh.
at 17. And so I basically had a few weeks to even process my strategy, which was
Hmm.
to keep it completely private and lead a double life. That made sense to me at that time. That's what I did in college. So that was fun. But yeah, so I just kind of left home, a month after the diagnosis.
Wow. Sure. So I mean that's very different than 13 where you're not really planning on going anywhere and you probably haven't thought about what's happening beyond the next couple weeks.
Yeah, you know I definitely felt like, with the diagnosis, I think, is when I first became familiar with this sort of pressing notion of sort of time, and sort of the
Mhm.
clock ticking kind of thing. I think, as you say, when you're that young, you're often carefree, and your sense of time is like a week is an eternity, right? And
Right.
you meet someone who's 44, which is how old I am now, and you think, man, 44, that's impossibly old. No, no one was alive then. But so, with the diagnosis, I definitely, started to feel like, well, I want to move as quickly as I can to accomplish as much as I can. Because I had assumed, like a lot of people, particularly like a lot of sighted people, I had
Hmm.
wrongly assumed, that blindness was going to ruin my life and, mean the end of achievement and independence for me. And so I kind of wanted to get as much in before I started to live this sort of small and sad little life that I just decided in my head was a foregone conclusion.
Right, right. Well, and being I guess a progressive loss of sight, and neither of you knew how long that would take, right? Um, so I mean, what was kind of the timeline for each of you on losing your sight? I don't know if one of you was faster or.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's common in families where siblings share the same genetic disease for it to have a different progression, because our genes interact with other genes and
Mm-hmm.
lifestyle and factors and all that kind of thing. Your sex, all of that. So I mean, for me, it progressed slower than Isaac and my older sister,
Hmm.
but it is very tricky because there's no actual rate you can know it in your
Right.
mind. You kind of adjust to certain things, and then a year later you're readjusting. So it is
Yeah, I
hard to
mean the
tell. Yeah.
mind is good at sort of continuing to try to work with what it's getting, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
It's the
And it
ultimate
Mhm.
keeps going.
prediction machine,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the human brain. Yeah. I lost my sight more quickly than my sisters, as Daria mentioned. I always share with people that, or often share with people, it's not my opening line. Hi, nice to meet you. And by the way, losing sight for me at least was a lot harder than just being blind.
Hmm.
Precisely because of the sort of emotional negotiating that you wind up doing, with yourself and with God and with whatever, and you say, geez, if it would just stay the way it is today, you know,
Right.
to your point, Matt, my brain has adapted and I've figured out how to cope with today. It's tomorrow that I'm worried about. And to do that for 10 years um, is exhausting and terrifying.
Right.
Um, and
Right.
uh, and, argue, and certainly unnecessary, which is something, obviously I argue in my book and, definitely want to leave your listeners with that impression.
For sure. How did your parents react? I mean, three of their four children suddenly diagnosed with this. How would you say they reacted?
I think they
So we're
did go
keeping it
into
light
find a
this Saturday
solution
morning,
mode.
huh, Matt?
Yeah, exactly. Go
Dara, why
for
don't
it.
you go ahead?
I mean, I think along the lines of what Isaac was saying, and I didn't mean to cut you off, they really went into this sort of like, you're not going to be blind. We're going to find a cure. We just have to meet the right scientist and raise enough funds. And so we kind of went into this action mode. I was very, very private when I was younger, so we were kind of thrust into this public in our community, our beloved Cuban Jewish community in Miami. We were thrust into this, coming out in the Miami Herald, and look at this family and
Hmm.
the three kids going blind, and let's raise money and help them find a cure. Which, I mean, I think it's great to fundraise for science, but I think
Sure.
at that time, at least when we were young in the early years, there wasn't a lot of room for contemplating what life would be like and how it was doable as blind people.
Mm.
It was more like a race to find the hero that was going to help us, right? Iz, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, no, just exactly what you said. It was for me, especially having been diagnosed in advance of any symptoms, and then next thing you know, my parents just were determined, as Daria said, to solve this problem for their children, which is very natural and frankly a very laudable reaction. But so I spent a while really trying to help that effort with my folks and with the amazing community that enveloped us with support, like Daria mentioned. And that was all fine and good until I said, oh, I'm going to this is a race against blindness, and it's a race I'm going to win, and I'm not going to have to confront all these awful things that I've told myself
Mm.
are necessary consequences of blindness. And then before I knew it, blindness, it was, any sober assessment of the situation would say blindness was way out in front of the scientists.
Mhm.
And while the supporting research was great, I really had not done a damn thing to learn about going blind or being blind, or what I would actually do to cope with the day to day and the very specific, tangible challenges that we face. And so
Sure.
there really was a sort of pivot moment when I uh, kind of said, you know what, I think I'm going to cool out a little bit on this, finding a cure and sort of trying to be out front, raising money and awareness. And I'm going to instead kind of turn inward with my uh, then girlfriend or fiance, now of course wife of more than 20 years.
That's
And
awesome.
we're gonna figure out how to make the small practical, how to implement the small practical solutions that will make life you know uh livable and enjoyable. And
Yeah,
so
no, I thought you had a really interesting line in your book where you say that you confused working for a cure with fighting your fears. Um,
yeah,
it's very interesting.
yeah, thanks, that is a good line.
That's a great line. And Isaac and I also discussed we had to sort of, at least for me, stop viewing blindness as a villain,
Mhm.
accept it as just a part of who we were. So that
Right.
was a huge shift too. Like in our
Yeah,
mind, it was the villain and the cure was the hero, and
Sure.
not a villain. It's just a part of,
Right.
who we are that leads to a lot of great qualities and resilience and all that. So.
Was there something, because of course you're losing eyesight over time. Was there something just so specific about the idea of just losing, like total blindness? It sounds like that was kind of a line, maybe separate from. Is that just because at any point you figured I've got something to work with?
for me, yes. uh Although that's something sort of, it's so hard to explain this to sighted
Sure.
folks or folks who haven't had a similar experience, but that's something that you have left, at least with a condition like retinitis pigmentosa, where you're sort of basically randomly losing photoreceptor cells
Right.
at the back of your eye, and it's producing this bizarre, you know, uh, a visual reality in which objects appear or morph or disappear, and you can't figure it gets to a point where, for me, it was kind of like a relief a little bit to say, you know what, screw it. Like this isn't great. I mean, it's harder to try to struggle to piece together my life with with the little bit I got left here,
Mhm.
as fickle as it is. And like, screw it. I'm gonna jump to the other side and go, hey, I want to learn to live a blessed life
Right.
as a blind man, and any glimpses or shards of sight that I might get, here or there, those are extra. Those are a bonus. Those are
Right.
a blessing. Um, and then eventually, at least in the types of conditions we're talking about here, you don't you lose that too, and then
Right.
you're just totally blind. For me, the turning point was when my again, now wife's mother, who is coincidentally my mother-in-law, came came up to was coming up to Boston to visit Dorothy and me, and she was the director of occupational therapy at a spinal cord center, one of the leading spinal cord centers and injury centers in the world.
Mm.
So she had seen a lot of you know folks come in. Yesterday they were perfectly quote unquote fine, and today they're quadriplegic. And Brenda shows up and helps them figure out how to make the rest of their life work. So she as she started to realize that Dorothy was unable to shake me off and that I might be around for a little while. Um, she set out to learn more about it for herself, and she found the vision rehabilitation specialist in Boston.
Hmm.
And so she was coming up to visit Dorothy and me, and she said, "Hey, Dorothy, you want to come with me to see this vision rehabilitation specialist so we can learn more about what's going on, with Isaac and how you can help him."
Hmm.
Well, I was the last to know about this. And I mean, I remember literally being like, oh my God, my, again, then girlfriend and her mom are going to go meet a vision rehabilitation specialist to learn about ways like I can have a, safer, more fulfilling, easier life. Maybe I should go along too. And it was the weirdest thing. I literally like asked, I was like, hey, Dorothy, do you think your mom would mind if I came too? And she was like, I think my mom would think it was a pretty damn good idea,
That's great.
So that was really a major turning point for me because when I went to go meet with that, said vision rehabilitation specialist, there was just a panorama of tools and options and technologies and
Sure.
techniques, all sorts of things that I had assumed I would, lose forever. Of course, those foolishness. I had been terrified about losing the ability to interact with my computer,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
just hadn't done anything. Couldn't be bothered to learn anything about what that looks like. But this vision rehabilitation specialist, of course, taught me about screen reading software and just a million other things.
Sure.
And that was a big day for me. I remember, and that was kind of again where I said, look, maybe now I want to live my life focused, instead of maybe 80% on cures, maybe it's 10 or 15, and the rest is going to be focusing on day to day, the just living my life.
Yeah, it's interesting. The saddest thing I had a friend years ago who, his parents were sort of stopping him from learning various skills. At the time, he was probably in a good spot to learn Braille and some other things, and they had this perception that it would make him appear more blind to the other students in his class. And it was
Oof.
one of those things where it's just that, these skills are so important and you become so much more independent that outweighs any perception of you, being blind or less in that regard. So taking the
No
time to really
doubt.
learn these skills is so
Plus,
important.
what's the message you're sending there is that
Right.
it's
Wow.
somehow bad to be blind, and you don't want people to think you're blind. I mean,
Right. Right.
which
And
is a
so he was,
particularly tough message to swallow if you're going blind.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So
For sure.
yeah.
So
I
the
still have
other,
some
yeah,
central
go ahead, Daria.
eyesight. So Isaac's been like kind of a guide for me, even though
Mm,
he's younger, in terms of always like taking the next step. So that's been such a gift for me, really, really helpful. I just wanted to
sure.
mention that.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's kind. Well, and now my bag of tricks is empty. Or you're already familiar with
No,
everything in
it's
there.
not.
So
You have a million tricks left. My
all
bet's
right,
on you for sure. So.
cool.
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, I know for myself, I was diagnosed at 3. I don't have any memories of a point where I could actually trust my vision. Um,
Mhm.
the strangest thing for me was I lost motion vision last. So I grew up having just enough vision to use shadows from trees to drive ATVs around our cabin property.
Oh
um,
well.
and would be doing that and could actually do that longer than I could read really large print because I was moving at the as I drove. um so that was
Wow.
the strangest thing for
Yeah.
me. And the fun thing was, of course, people would come out and think it was so dangerous to let their kid drive, and my parents would point out, our son's on the front one and he's blind, so it's probably okay.
Ah, yeah, exactly.
So, um, for me with that, um, and why I titled this project and the podcast "Defending Vision," is my experience was more, um, being blind for most of the time that people knew me as a kid, and certainly teachers. Um, my experience was really people. Yeah, I would have a goal because I didn't know different, so I figured, okay, I want to achieve X, Y, or Z. I want to be good at math or something like that. And I'd have a teacher say, "Well, you're never gonna have a job that requires math, so there's no point in you learning it." um,
Oof.
and so I had sort of that experience. I never, I guess, had a. I just kind of assumed, well, these are goals people want to achieve, and I want to achieve them, and so I kind of had to play the defensive role of you tell me I can't, well, I'm gonna double down now, and find a way to do it and maybe prove you wrong. Um, so I was kind of struck, Isaac, in your TED talk, you mentioned that blindness gave you vision in that sense. And
Mhm.
so you went through both of you went through a very different experience in you had a plan for your future, and then had this come along and, at least if nothing else, I guess, make you pivot, right?
Sure. Daria, why don't you take it?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because we were diagnosed at ages where you feel invincible, we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But at 17, I didn't have such a definitive plan. I was heading to
Sure.
college, and but I agree. I mean, there's so many gifts that have come from it. If I could go back in time and be, out of the closet in college, for example, and not completely terrified for years, but you kind of have to go through it to get to the other side, I guess, and
Right.
and I think in a way, it helped me not sweat the little stuff, in college
Mm-hmm.
or beyond. Like, you kind of really knows what matters, and you feel grateful for the things you have. So
It'll teach perspective very quickly.
No doubt.
absolutely,
For sure.
no doubt. And that's just like a priceless thing to come from it, but
Right.
No doubt. And that's exactly, the kind of thing that I have in mind, Daria, when, I talk about how, sight is different from vision. And, I lost my sight, but I gained vision in the process. I'm going blind. It's also just,
you'll be proud of me. I always say now that I'm losing my sight. I don't say I'm losing my vision anymore.
yeah, that's my own little.
You were a stickler for that.
Yep.
No, for sure.
I agree
Yeah.
with that.
That's my own little pet campaign. I don't like it when people start to confuse vision for sight, because vision, of course, means a lot more.
Right.
And in fact, losing sight, I think, amplifies vision, or being blind
Mm-hmm.
gives you different sorts of vision.
Sure.
But yeah, certainly in terms of plans and stuff, I was a childhood actor, and I was out in LA, and I was, thought I had all the time in the world to just kind of give LA and acting its best shot or whatever. And then you know, by the time I was 13, 14, 15 years old, and I sort of did make it out to LA, not only had I been diagnosed, but I was losing sight more rapidly than I think anyone expected. Certainly more rapidly than I had hoped. And at that point, there was a real quick pivot. Again, like we were talking about earlier, Matt, this sense of time is against you. And so I just said, this acting thing's not going to be for me long term for a bunch of reasons. And, by the way, I really want to get to college as quickly as I can. So I actually started college a couple weeks after I turned 16.
Overachiever.
Yeah, if I had to do it over again, or if I were, counseling one of my children, I don't necessarily think it's the greatest move. But again, at the time, I would have said, it was the only move. So,
if you would like to learn more, go to defendingvision.com. And if you enjoyed the show, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.